Tonight, we begin with a quiet story, not of kings or grand castles, but of ordinary people living through extraordinary cold, medieval peasants, humble, resilient, and quietly heroic. They faced some of the harshest winters in history. No heating, no insulation, only each other, and their will to survive. Before we begin, make yourself comfortable, dim the lights, let your body relax, and if you enjoy these soft journeys through time, feel free to subscribe, and let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath and drift with me into a world long gone. When we imagine the Middle Ages, we often picture knights on horseback, colorful banners, feasts and music, and village fairs. But for most people, for the peasants, winter was something else entirely. It wasn't festive. It was survival. Winter came like a cruel teacher, cold, harsh, and unforgiving. Every year, without mercy. Now imagine this. Your home is no castle, just a small hut, built of mud, sticks, and hope. The walls are so thin, you might hear a bird sneeze outside. There's no insulation, no glass in the windows, just a small hole, covered with stretched animal skin. No thermostat wars, no warm blankets. Inside your home, it's only a little warmer than the world outside. If it's freezing outdoors, inside is just slightly less freezing. A small comfort. Nights were the hardest. Darkness settled early. The wind howled through the trees, and the fire in the hearth flickered quietly, trying its best. But its warmth barely reached beyond the first few feet. If you sat far from the flames, you might as well have been outside. Clothing didn't help much. No soft furs, no thick quilts, just rough wool tunics, maybe a cloak, one that smelled faintly of goat. You'd try to layer everything you owned, hoping to trap the heat, like turning yourself into a human onion. But the cold always found a way in. Beds were little more than sacks filled with straw, perhaps a few old rushes thrown in, and always a few fleas for company. Luxury was not the word for it. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, or simply never waking up. For children and the elderly, each morning was a quiet miracle. If you woke up breathing, you had already won. Maybe even celebrated with a not quite frozen turnip. Survival wasn't about comfort. It was about persistence, wearing everything you had, huddling with the animals, clenching your jaw, and hoping your eyebrows didn't freeze overnight. And the truth is, this was only the beginning. Think your apartment gets drafty in winter? Medieval peasants would kindly disagree. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were wind tunnels, with walls that barely held together. Most peasant homes were built with a method called wattle and daub. Wooden sticks woven together, then smeared with mud, straw, and animal dung. Yes, dung. Not to be unpleasant, but it worked. It was sticky, and always available. Not that anyone took much comfort in it, because during the coldest months, even stepping inside your own home could feel like walking through a frozen marsh. The cold came from every direction, from above, from beneath, from within. A quiet, relentless attack on your body's warmth. But medieval peasants, they didn't complain. They didn't have time for that. They got creative. They stuffed moss into the cracks, pressed old rags into the worst drafts, and leaned into each other for warmth. Human bodies became the only insulation that mattered. Sometimes it was ingenuity, sometimes just plain stubbornness, and sometimes a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the wall. That's all that stood between you and becoming a medieval ice sculpture. If your house was falling apart and your best protection against the wind was mud and goat hair, well, at least you could try to laugh about it. That is, if your jaw wasn't frozen shut. And while the cold air surrounded you, another enemy rose silently from below, the ground itself. Medieval floors weren't really floors at all, just slightly flatter patches of dirt inside what you called a home. If you were lucky, someone had scattered some straw or laid down dried rushes, just enough to give the illusion that it might help. But make no mistake, you were sleeping one aching back away from the hard, frozen earth. And that cold, it crept upward, quiet and merciless, slipping through the straw, curling into your limbs, until it reached your bones, and then even deeper. Drop anything on the ground during a winter night, and it was gone. Frozen solid. Part of the house now. Some tried to fight back. If you had the means, you might lay thick straw mats over the floor. More likely, though, you'd borrow straw from your neighbor's field and hope no one noticed. It helped for a little while. But straw flattened quickly. It grew mold even faster, and it added a new soundtrack to your nights. A soft, sad crunching beneath every step. Others used dried rushes instead. They didn't remove the old ones, just piled fresh layers on top. Over time, this built up a strange new world, a living, breathing mix of damp leaves, fleas, and creatures better left unnamed. It was the medieval version of carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, a little wet, and smelled like a wet dog. And then there were the beds. For those fortunate enough to have one, they were nothing more than wooden frames stuffed with hay. No soft mattress, no cozy pillows, just scratchy straw, poking and shifting underneath you, while the cold seeped up from the ground below. Tossing and turning didn't mean rest. It was a slow, awkward dance, to keep your blood moving and your limbs from freezing. Peasants didn't defeat the icy ground. They simply learned to float uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't measured in dreams. It was measured in toes, and if you woke up with all of yours still attached, you were doing better than most. Now, if anything deserved the title of hero inside a peasant's winter home, it wasn't the roof, or the patchwork walls, not even the straw or the dung. It was the hearth, a simple, smoldering fire, at the center of it all. No elegant stone fireplace, no chimney reaching into the sky, just a pit, lined with stones, filled with half-burned wood, and a fire that flickered bravely against the dark. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Smoke filled the room, and since there was no chimney, it simply found its own way out, through holes in the thatched roof, through gaps in the walls, or not at all. Sometimes it just settled around you, thick and heavy, turning the air into a slow-cooked stew. It wasn't good for your lungs, and probably not for your lifespan, but it had a silver lining. The smoke helped drive away fleas and other unwanted guests. No pest control needed when you're marinating in firewood and ash every single day. The hearth wasn't just heat. It was the kitchen, the light, and in some quiet way, the heart of the home. People gathered around it, shared stories, ate their meals, watched the flames dance, like a silent show for a world that had no screens. People gathered around the fire, sharing stories, gossiping softly, or simply gazing into the flames, because honestly, there wasn't much else to do after the sun went down. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just tradition, it was survival. Letting the fire go out during the night was like inviting the cold inside and asking it to stay. Starting a fire again wasn't easy. There were no matches, no lighters, only flint, steel, a bit of dry kindling, and more quiet prayers than most offered all year. Everyone had a job. Someone watched the embers, someone added peat or twigs, or, if fortune smiled, a rare dry piece of wood. The fire was always under threat. The cold waited just beyond the walls, ready to smother it, and everything it stood for. The hearth didn't promise survival, but without it, survival wasn't even on the table. It was smoky, faint, sometimes disappointing. But in a medieval winter, that flickering flame was the last line of defense, the fragile heartbeat of hope. There was only one thing peasants feared more than running out of ale, and that was letting the fire die overnight. Without it, the cold crept in faster than a tax collector after harvest, and restarting a fire in the dead of winter, not just inconvenient, potentially deadly. No matches, no easy spark. You needed flint, steel, tender hands, and a miracle of timing. Imagine trying all this in the dark, half asleep, with frozen fingers, while a wolf howls in the distance. That's motivation. So peasants got clever. They banked the fire, not in gold, but in ash. Before bedtime, they carefully buried the glowing embers under a thick layer of ash. The ash acted like a blanket, trapping the warmth, protecting the coals, keeping them alive just long enough for morning. If done properly, you could wake up, poke the pile, add some kindling, and, like magic, the fire would rise again. But if you got it wrong, the cold greeted you first, and so did everyone else's bad mood. Fire banking became a family ritual, passed from parent to child like a treasured recipe. Everyone had their way. Some swore by dry ash. Others believed a little moisture helped. Some packed the embers tightly. Others left them breathing room. You could start a full medieval debate just by suggesting a new method. It was like arguing about how to barbecue, except this time your fingers might fall off if you lost the argument. And sometimes, even banking wasn't enough. A sudden wind could slip through the wall and blow it out, or a curious sheep might wander too close and stomp it by accident. Yes, it happened. So families took turns, waking up in the middle of the night to check on the coals, the medieval version of walking half asleep to the thermostat. In the end, it wasn't about mastering the fire. It was about buying a few more precious hours of warmth. And if, by morning, even a single ember still glowed, that alone was a reason to keep going. In medieval winters, the phrase, "the more, the merrier," wasn't about parties. It was a survival strategy. When the fire grew dim and the wind howled through every tiny gap, there was only one sure source of heat: each other. If that meant sleeping shoulder to shoulder with your entire family, your neighbors, a few livestock, and a deeply confused goose, so be it. Forget personal space. Forget privacy. Those were luxuries no one had time for. On the coldest nights, comfort wasn't the goal. Not freezing to the floor was. Entire households would pile together in the warmest corner of the room. Wrapped in every bit of cloth they owned, they formed a kind of snoring, shivering human lasagna. Children curled between parents, grandparents tucked along the edges, and if Cousin Ethel arrived unexpectedly, there was always space for one more body in the pile. If you were lucky, you got the middle. Warm on every side, a human sandwich of survival. But if you were stuck on the edge, you might as well have been sleeping next to the door of a meat locker, and heaven help the one who moved too much during the night. One wrong shift, and you might send poor Aunt Maud rolling into the cold draft by the wall. Congratulations, you're now the family villain. Even the bedding was shared. One straw mattress, flattened each night under the weight of 3 or 4 generations, creaking, crunching, and somehow still enough to make it to morning. And of course, hygiene wasn't exactly a medieval strong suit. Let's just say the sleeping arrangements weren't known for their fragrance, but when it came down to you versus frostbite, you stopped being picky. Body heat wasn't just pleasant, it was strategy. Some medieval guides even recommended it, placing the strongest, warmest people on the outside of the sleeping group, like human shields against the night air. Babies and fragile elders were tucked deep into the center. Precious little furnaces, wrapped in layers of cloth and family care. But it wasn't all desperation. Over time, this closeness became tradition, night after night, sharing warmth and space and the quiet hours before dawn. It led to stories whispered under wool blankets, songs hummed gently in the dark, and perhaps a few sleepy conversations that wandered through laughter and dreams. So next time your sibling steals your blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a goat that seems to be judging you. If you think modern roommates are challenging, medieval peasants would like to introduce you to their winter housemates: cows, goats, pigs, chickens, anything with a heartbeat and a bit of body heat. Bringing livestock indoors wasn't just a quirky village habit. It was survival, in homes with little insulation and wind that howled louder than your stomach. Every degree of warmth counted, and if your goat was sleeping beside you, it was less likely to disappear in the middle of the night. 2 birds, one very fragrant stone. At night, the house transformed into a chaotic, living furnace. Chickens nested in corners, pigs snorted softly near the fire, cows leaned lazily against the walls, chewing cud like they owned the place. It wasn't glamorous. Far from it. If you've ever been stuck in a car with someone who skipped their shower, imagine that. Now imagine it's a cow, it's winter, and there's absolutely nowhere else to go. The smells? Legendary. By springtime, the scent of a shared winter was strong enough to make your eyes water. But peasants learned to ignore it. They developed a selective nose. They didn't complain much, because deep down, they knew something important. More animals inside meant fewer frozen toes in the morning, and in the world they lived in, that was a fair trade. Certain animals even had preferred spots. Cows, the largest and warmest, were usually right by the family. Goats got in close too, because, well, goats tend to go wherever they want. Chickens roosted in baskets or up in the rafters, and pigs didn't care. They'd plop down anywhere they pleased, probably right in the middle of the room. Of course, sharing a bedroom with livestock came with its own hazards. Imagine drifting off peacefully, only to wake up with a chicken nesting in your hair, or stepping out of bed onto something warm and very suspicious. Medieval mornings could be full of surprises, but despite the chaos and the smells and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants knew the truth. Cold kills, and cows cuddle, whether they want to or not. In the war against winter's icy grip, sometimes the warm breath of a slightly slobbery cow was the deciding factor between life and death. Fashion in the Middle Ages wasn't about looking good. It was about staying alive. No one cared about trends. They cared about layers, as many as they could find. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes, all at once. Start with the basics. A scratchy linen undertunic, not the cleanest, but it worked. Over that, a thicker wool tunic, and maybe another if you had it. Add leggings, loose at the knees and not quite warm enough. Then came a cloak, heavy, rough, often held together by patches and a bit of luck, and if you were truly fortunate, a sheepskin thrown over your shoulders like a prized treasure. Congratulations, you were now maybe 10% warmer and 90% itchier. Boots were a rare luxury. Most peasants wrapped their feet in cloth or old rags and shoved them into wooden clogs. If the cold still crept in, and it usually did, you just added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe. Washing clothes in winter? Not a good idea. That meant breaking the ice on a frozen stream and then waiting 2 full days for your only shirt to dry, if it didn't freeze solid first. Most people wisely accepted that smelling like smoke, sweat, and sheep was a small price to pay for not freezing to death. And strangely, there was a hidden benefit. All that dirt and grease formed a kind of insulation, a grimy shield that trapped body heat inside. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. Think of it as a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, just smellier, and far less acceptable at social events. Hats, scarves, and gloves were prized possessions. A single woolen cap could mean the difference between a good night's sleep and waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves in the medieval world weren't crafted in elegant shops. They were handmade, stitched together from scraps of leather or fabric that someone had scavenged or saved. They often looked more like sad puppet costumes than anything truly wearable. But they worked, most of the time. Children were especially bundled up, wrapped so tightly they looked like little overstuffed turnips, waddling from one room to another. The goal wasn't fashion, it was heat, style, and elegance. Never heard of them. Warmth was the true medieval flex. So the next time you complain about throwing on a few layers for a cold day, remember this. Peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags, and feeling lucky to be doing so. In the medieval peasant survival guide, dirt wasn't something to wash away. It was a tool. Grime, mud, natural body oils. They were part of a carefully curated system. You see, winter came with a very particular problem: heat loss. And oddly enough, clean clothes weren't great at preventing it. Fresh linen breathed too easily, which was fine in summer, but in winter, breathable meant cold. That's where dirt stepped in. As days passed and laundry remained just a distant dream, layers of grime began to build on tunics, cloaks, leggings. It wasn't glamorous, but over time, those greasy, muddy layers started filling the tiny gaps in fabric, making clothing more wind-resistant. It was like medieval weatherproofing, just smellier. Yes, you might smell like a goat who'd had a rough week, but you were warm. And that, in the eyes of a medieval peasant, was a clear win. In fact, some believed that washing too much in winter could actually make you sick, so they kept their protective filth barrier intact. Bathing was rare, laundry, even rarer. Soap? If you had it, you saved it for very special occasions, like when the bishop was visiting, or just before your funeral. Instead of washing, you simply layered up. You didn't change the old clothes, you just put the new ones over top. Eventually, you became a walking archive of the past 6 weeks. Every layer, a chapter in your winter survival story. To an outsider, you may have looked like you'd given up on hygiene altogether, but the peasants knew better. That crusty tunic? It was a thermal shield, a line of defense against frostbite and bitter winds. It wasn't pretty, but neither was freezing to death because you wanted to smell like lavender. Besides, in a world where everyone stank, no one noticed. Nose blindness was simply a way of life. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't failure. It was fashion. It was function. And if, by February, you had a thick, greasy coat of grime, you were winning. If you're picturing medieval peasants cozied up in feather beds, surrounded by embroidered quilts, you might want to adjust that image. Reality was far more rustic. And by rustic, we mean, let's sleep on a pile of dead plants and hope for the best. Beds, if you had one, were simple wooden frames, covered with a sack stuffed with straw, hay, or dried rushes. No memory foam, no springs, no hotel experience, just a crunchy, pokey pile that smelled faintly of livestock and regret. Every movement during the night was greeted by the gentle music of crinkling straw and the occasional stab from a particularly enthusiastic stalk. Some peasants didn't even bother with the wooden frame. They just tossed the straw right on the dirt floor. A natural, ground-level sleeping experience. Something today's influencers might rebrand as earth-connected slumber. These mattresses weren't just uncomfortable, they were temporary. The straw flattened quickly, grew moldy even quicker, invited bugs, and eventually transformed into a sort of biological hazard zone. Changing the straw in your bed wasn't something done casually. It was an event, maybe 2, 3 times a year, if you were particularly diligent, or whenever your bed started moving on its own. Some opted for rushes instead, long grasses spread across the floor in thick, tangled mats. If you were lucky, they might be mixed with herbs, lavender, rosemary, a soft attempt to mask the overwhelming scent of life among livestock. And for a little while, it worked. Fresh rushes smelled almost lovely for a day. After that, they joined the muddy, trampled, fragrant chaos of the home, blending with dirt, crumbs, and anything else that wandered in. Then there were the bedfellows, and they didn't all snore. Fleas, lice, and other curious critters loved straw beds almost as much as the peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations, you were living the authentic medieval experience. But despite the itching, despite the smells, these humble heaps of straw were lifesavers. They offered a precious layer of insulation against the frozen ground. And when families huddled together on top, wrapped in cloth and each other, they created small pockets of warmth, tiny, shared sanctuaries in the heart of winter, medieval central heating in its most literal form. So the next time you stretch out on a soft, supportive mattress, somewhere out there, a medieval peasant is looking down from history, grinning through a few missing teeth, and whispering, "Must be nice." When your house is made of sticks, mud, and hope, a winter breeze isn't just annoying, it's a declaration of war. The battle wasn't just outside, it was inside. Peasants didn't just fight the cold with cloaks and fires. They fought it with whatever they could shove into the endless cracks in their homes. And there were plenty of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged, and every gust of wind seemed to find a brand new way in. Sealing the house became an art. They stuffed holes with moss, with straw, with scraps of cloth and bundles of dried grass, even animal hair. If it was soft, squishy, or vaguely insulating, it had a place in the wall. Some even added new layers of mud and dung to the outside of their homes each winter. Picture it, standing outside in the cold, slapping cold manure onto your house, muttering, "This is fine, this is luxury." And in its own way, it was. Roof leaks were another front in the war. Thatch might have been cheap, but it wasn't exactly waterproof. After a few seasons of rain and snow, it sagged, it split, and it leaked. Peasants patched holes with rags, with reeds, or in moments of true desperation, with chunks of turf stolen from the nearest field. Over time, their homes began to look like patchwork quilts, stitched together not with thread, but with willpower. Doors, windows. If you had them, you were fortunate. But even then, they were often just rough wooden planks, hanging on stubborn nails and silent prayers. Windows were usually covered with thick cloth or animal hide, sometimes soaked in fat to block the worst of the wind. That helped, a little, and added a certain mysterious aroma to the room. Every night became a quiet battle between human creativity and the relentless, sneaky cold. One moment, you were wrapped in warmth. The next, a sudden gust slipped through and tapped you on the shoulder like a frosty ghost. But peasants endured. Through clever hands and stubborn hearts, they patched, they stuffed, they smeared mud and tucked cloth, one frozen crack at a time. Winter may have knocked, but it was not always invited in. When the cold bit deep enough to steal your sleep, peasants didn't pretend that everyone could rest peacefully all night. Instead, they adapted. They slept in shifts. It wasn't an organized system. There were no whistles, no formal rotation, just quiet understanding and sheer necessity. Half the household stayed awake, tending the fire, guarding the warmth, and patching the weak spots in the walls. The other half curled up, beneath threadbare blankets, upon piles of straw, and drifted into shallow, flickering sleep. Because the fire needed constant care, and the night was always longer than it seemed. If you left the fire alone, it would fade, and relighting it, well, it was about as easy as convincing a stubborn donkey to do a little dance. So someone had to stay on ember patrol, and once you were finally warmish, even just a little, no one wanted to move. So the job rotated. You'd doze for a while, then feel an elbow in your ribs. Your turn. You'd stumble half asleep to the hearth, poke at the embers, prod a reluctant log, and mutter a few creative curses at the smoke, trying not to trip over the goat. It wasn't glamorous. There were no night vision goggles, no midnight snacks, no snooze buttons, just stiff joints, heavy eyelids, and a quiet, growing resentment toward whoever was snoring the loudest during your shift. Children, as soon as they could hold a stick, were drafted into duty. They learned early. In winter, everyone helped, or everyone froze. Grandparents often stayed by the fire longer, not just for their wisdom, but because getting up again was, quite frankly, a monumental event. And when it was finally your turn to rest, good luck. People shuffled around, animals stirred, the wind pressed against the walls, and your sibling might roll over a little too hard and jab you with an elbow. Sleep was something of a miracle, but the system worked. There were always eyes on the fire, always hands, cold, tired, but determined, ready to keep it alive. The embers survived, and so did the people gathered around them. So next time you sigh about having to get up to adjust the thermostat or let the cat out, spare a thought for the medieval peasant squinting into a smoky hearth at 3 a.m., wondering if toes were really all that important. Because when it's truly cold, you even have to think about how you breathe. That's right. Peasants didn't just fight the cold with cloaks, fires, and sleeping shifts. They learned how to breathe to stay alive. Open-mouthed breathing pulled the freezing air straight into your lungs. And in a world where pneumonia could be a death sentence, that was a mistake you only made once. So they practiced what you might call survival breathing. Slow, shallow, always through the nose. This gently warmed the air before it reached the lungs. Not perfect, but better than coughing yourself into the grave by midwinter. If you accidentally took a deep gasp of cold air, congratulations. You just signed up for a week of hacking up pieces of your soul while Grandma brewed hot onion tea and whispered firm prayers beside you. Some folks even tucked bits of their cloaks or rags over their mouths while they slept. Makeshift breath warmers. Of course, you'd wake up with a soggy patch of cloth clinging to your face, but it beat freezing from the inside out. Children learned these tricks early. Parents would scold them for panting like little puppies indoors. And honestly, between breathing drills, itchy layers of wool, and sleeping next to an extremely flatulent goat, medieval childhood was one long masterclass in character building. At night, tucked into straw beds, under heaps of cloaks, beside a warm, snoring cow, breathing became an art, slow, steady, through the nose, as minimal as possible, like some grim medieval version of a yoga retreat, with more frostbite and far fewer inspirational quotes. In the survival playbook, it wasn't the flashiest tactic, but it worked. One shallow breath at a time, peasants made it through another night in the long war against winter. And there was one more secret weapon, an unlikely one. A full stomach. Turns out, fending off the cold wasn't always about cloaks and coals. Sometimes, it was about calories. The more your body had to digest, the warmer it got just doing the work. It's what you might call basic medieval thermodynamics. Eat a heavy meal, generate some inner warmth, and maybe, just maybe, make it to morning without turning into a peasant-shaped popsicle. So, what did medieval peasants eat before settling into their straw-filled beds? Thick stews, packed with root vegetables, turnips, onions, parsnips. Grains were essential too. Oat porridge, barley gruel, dense, chewy rye bread that could double as a doorstop. And if you were especially lucky, after a feast day or a generous village slaughter, maybe, just maybe, a slice of dried sausage or a precious hunk of salted pork might find its way into the pot. This wasn't comfort food in the Instagram sense. No fancy plating, no artful garnishes, just one large, vaguely brown mass of food, meant to sit in your stomach like a friendly brick, slowly burning through the long, cold hours of night. It wasn't about eating a lot. It was about eating smart. Slow digesting foods meant a slow trickle of warmth. Fatty meals were especially prized, not just for energy, but because fat burns slower than lean meat. So a belly full of stew, bread, and a slightly questionable amount of lard, that was peak medieval winter luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest children ate. Little Thomas didn't like turnips. Too bad. You ate the turnips, or you spent the night dreaming about how much you missed them. Harsh, but effective. Classic medieval parenting. Of course, eating that much before bed came with its own hazards. You might be warm, but your dreams? Strange, vivid, fueled by a stomach trying to process half a garden in one sitting. Was it worth it? Absolutely. Because peasants weren't aiming for a gourmet experience. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant falling asleep full, bloated, and nose-breathing next to a steaming cow, then so be it. Just another night in the long quest to see another sunrise, long before electric blankets or memory foam mattresses. Peasants had to get creative for a little bedtime warmth. And that's where two humble heroes came in, the hay box and the heated stone. Let's start with the hay box. It sounds rustic. And it was. But the idea was pure genius. Take a sturdy wooden box, line it with hay, and tuck inside food that had been cooked earlier in the day. A pot of porridge, some leftover stew. Wrap it, nestle it into the hay, and it would stay warm for hours, like a medieval slow cooker. But why stop at food? Peasants realized something. If hay could trap the warmth of a stew, it could trap something even better: heat from a stone. Enter the heated stone. Before bedtime, someone, probably whichever child lost the family argument, would grab a flat stone and toss it right into the heart of the fire. It would roast there until glowing hot. Not quite third-degree burn hot, but close. Then, using sticks or tongs, they'd pull it out, wrap it carefully in cloth or rags, sometimes slip it into a clay pot, and tuck it into the hay mattress or down by the foot of the bed. A homemade heating pad, simple, effective, and, if done right, gloriously warm. But there were risks. Wrap it poorly, you might wake up to a small fire under your blanket. Drop it on your foot? Let's just say, not all winter injuries came from ice. Still, when everything worked, that stone radiated a deep, comforting heat, enough to last for hours. It wasn't luxury, but in a half-frozen hut. Luxury meant not waking up with icicles on your nose. In the grand arsenal of winter survival tools, a hot rock in a pile of hay might not sound like much, but to a medieval peasant, it was a small, silent miracle. In truth, the hearth wasn't just for cooking dinner. It was almost a member of the family, temperamental, smoky, a bit unpredictable, but utterly essential, especially at night. The closer you were to the fire, the better your chances of waking up still unfrozen. Sleeping arrangements in a medieval home weren't about comfort, they were about strategy. Infants, elders, and anyone sick or frail got first pick. They were placed nearest the fire, the warmest, safest zone. From there, parents, older children, and sturdier adults fanned out like layers of human insulation. It wasn't just kindness, it was survival math. Babies were delicate heat sources, elders were carriers of family memory, and, if we're honest, the best gossip. Protecting them wasn't optional, but staying too close to the flames had its risks. You might wake up with singed hair, a smoldering cloak, or the telltale scent of someone who'd slept a little too close to dinner. Too far, and you were practically camping outside. It was a delicate balance, near enough to feel the warmth. Not so close you needed to explain why your beard smelled like roast mutton. The fire didn't heat evenly either. It mostly warmed whoever was directly in front of it. The rest huddled around the narrow glow like cold lizards fighting for a patch of sunlight. If you fell asleep facing the fire, you might enjoy one blissfully toasty side. The other side? So frozen you could knock on it like a wooden door. Pets and livestock joined in too. A dog might wedge itself between you and the fire, its tail wagging dangerously near the embers. Chickens perched on warm stones, clucking softly in their sleep, tiny feathered guardians of heat. Every pop of the log, every shift in the coals, was a quiet promise. You're still alive. You're still warm. For now. And so, peasants drifted into sleep. Not peaceful, not perfect, but wrapped in each other, in firelight, and in the sounds of a home holding on. Because in the medieval world, no one survived winter alone, unless they wanted to become a very stylish statue by January. Survival was never just personal, it was communal, a village effort, messy, muddy, noisy, but always shared. If your neighbor's house grew dark and silent, you noticed. If Tom's chimney stopped sending smoke into the sky, someone went to check. And not just because Tom owed you a chicken, though that helped. Community meant survival. Villages had unofficial winter watchers, The old, the young, the ones too frail to farm, but sharp enough to see who wasn't doing well. They noticed who coughed too much, who hadn't come to market, whose house looked too quiet in the morning frost. A kind of neighborhood watch, with more sheep and fewer reflective vests. If a family's fire went out, it was nearly an emergency. A good neighbor might show up with a glowing ember wrapped in rags, or they'd open their door and let the whole household in, smoke, chickens, and all. It meant squeezing 4 more bodies into an already overcrowded hut. But that was better than finding frozen friends come spring thaw. Communal food stores mattered too. In the worst winters, villages dipped into their last bits of salted meat, grain, and dried vegetables. It wasn't a feast, but it was enough to keep people going. Even children helped, delivering wood, sharing fire, running messages when someone needed help. No one was too small to matter when the cold came knocking. And yes, villages had arguments, goat disputes, land feuds, cooking pot drama. But when the frost crept in, grudges were shelved. Because today, it's your neighbor needing help. Tomorrow, it could be you. In the heart of winter, the village became a large, stubborn, and often ridiculous family. Sometimes dysfunctional, often loud, always determined to survive. One muddy boot, one shared ember, one frozen smile at a time, because when the fire burned low and the wind howled like wolves, peasants didn't just grab cloaks or check the straw, they prayed. Faith wasn't saved for Sundays, it was folded into every breath that steamed in the cold. A soft whisper in the night, asking, hoping, believing that morning would come again. Before slipping beneath the layers of straw and scratchy wool, families would kneel together in the dim light, offering hurried prayers for warmth, for a sturdy roof, and for their toes to still be there in the morning. Saints weren't just distant icons in stained glass. They were front-line defenders against the cold. Saint Blaise, called upon to protect sore throats. No small matter, when a single breath of icy air could send you into weeks of wheezing and pain. Saint Nicholas, long before jolly red robes, was known to guard homes against sudden ruin during the deadly, lean months. Superstition wrapped itself tightly around the nightly ritual of survival. Some families sprinkled holy water near the hearth before sleep, a simple gesture against dark forces, or at least mischievous drafts. Others marked their doorways with chalk on sacred days, a silent invitation for warmth and grace to come inside. Candles, too, had their part. Small vigil flames, sometimes blessed by a priest, sometimes just by the oldest, kindest woman in the village, were left burning through the night, soft, flickering hope against the clawing dark. And of course, there were promises. If we just make it through this night, Lord, I swear I'll be kinder to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips. Faith wasn't some distant idea. It was woven into every breath that steamed in the cold. Not a plea for riches, just for survival. A little heat, a little food. One more day. That was enough. These hopes were whispered into smoky rafters, folded into scratchy blankets, and tucked between the straw, carried softly through one more night. But for all their prayers, their cleverness, and their grit, sometimes it wasn't enough. When winter won, it didn't always come quietly. It didn't just take a few. It took families, whole villages, gone, under a shroud of snow and silence. Some winters were crueler than others, like the terrible famine winter of 1315, when the rains wouldn't stop, crops drowned, livestock starved, and the cold carved every hardship a little deeper. People whispered of eating bark, shoe leather, and, in the darkest tales, even each other. To let the fire go out wasn't just a mistake. It was often a death sentence. Without it, families huddled close for one final time. And come spring, neighbors might find them, still wrapped together, frozen in place, as if holding on could hold off the end. Sometimes, even the houses gave in. Roofs collapsed under the weight of ice and snow. Walls buckled in the silence. And dragging yourself through knee-deep drifts to knock on a neighbor's door offered no guarantee, especially if that neighbor had nothing left to share. Disease came too, softly at first, then swiftly. Starvation left bodies weak. Smoke-choked huts turned to sick rooms. Pneumonia, bronchitis. A simple cough in December could become a funeral by January. And then there was frostbite. Toes, fingers, ears, blackened, silent, and gone, even while still attached. Some survived, but winter still took a piece of them. A hand, a foot, a memory, a mark that said, "I lived." But winter left its signature. And perhaps the most haunting part was how normal it all was. Death wasn't a surprise. It was just another neighbor, wrapped in frost, waiting patiently at the door. Still, they pressed on, stubborn, grieving, alive. Because as long as one ember glowed, as long as breath still lingered in the frozen air, there was still a fight worth fighting. Today, when we picture medieval peasants, we often see the cracked hands, the chapped lips, the frost-bitten toes. We imagine the smoke-thick huts, the endless snow, the hunger. But beneath the struggle was something else, something stronger, a legacy of raw resilience, of quiet, daily courage, of enduring winter with nothing but grit, fire, and one another. No central heat, no thick jackets, no guarantees that spring would come for them. But they endured. And what they left behind wasn't just folklore or frozen footprints. They left us a blueprint for survival, a whisper of hope in the darkest season. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every hand-banked fire, every moss-crammed wall was a quiet, powerful testament to human creativity under pressure. Faced with impossible odds, they didn't give up. They adapted. They learned. From the land, from each other, and from every bitter lesson etched into the frost. Their villages weren't just built on shared soil. They were built on shared survival. They taught one another to watch the sick, to pool what little food was left, to trust that helping a freezing neighbor today meant someone might help you when the cold came knocking tomorrow. Because deep down, they knew no one survives winter alone, and their faith wasn't some lofty ideal. It was a kind of endurance woven into daily life, not just out of fear, but out of hope. Fragile, stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a little warmer, a little brighter, that after 100 dark nights, spring would come again, and life would push through the frozen ground. And somehow, it always did, because of their sacrifices, because of their persistence, because of small victories, surviving one more night, one more storm. And thanks to them, future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, they pushed humanity forward, enduring winters that would break even the bravest hearts today, until warmth and comfort became expectations instead of dreams. Their legacy is stitched invisibly into the life we now live. Every cozy blanket, every warm room, every winter evening spent beneath soft light, sipping something hot and sweet. All of it is the result of countless, nameless peasants who simply refused to surrender to the cold. So the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window, perhaps spare a quiet thought for them, the fearless ones, who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Anne Boleyn didn't enter the world with a crown on her head, or an army at her feet. She was born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall, or perhaps Hever Castle. The daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with strong family ties. In the grand scheme of Tudor society, her birth barely stirred the surface, and yet, from those modest beginnings, something extraordinary was taking shape. Anne Boleyn did not enter the world with a crown on her head or legions at her feet. Born around 1501, likely at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, she was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious court diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with ancient blood and powerful ties. In the grand hierarchy of Tudor England, Anne's birth barely stirred the air, but something extraordinary was already taking root. From a young age, Anne stood apart, not because of wealth, but because of mind. She was clever, sharp, and undeniably magnetic. Her family recognized it early and sent her abroad. In the court of Margaret of Austria, Anne caught her first glimpse of diplomacy, grace, and quiet political power. Then came France. In the elegant, watchful courts of Queen Claude and Queen Marguerite of Navarre, Anne learned to move through rooms not with submission, but with precision. While others embroidered by the fire, Anne mastered conversation, observation, flirtation, the subtle art of commanding attention without ever reaching for it. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, she was something rare, a woman who could match the polish of continental courts, but who carried the iron ambition of a rising English house. She wasn't called a classic beauty, but she was unforgettable. Dark, intelligent eyes, a voice that danced, a presence that changed the gravity of any room she entered. She took her place as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon, but even in the Queen's shadow, Anne flickered, not softly, but like a flame too stubborn to be hidden. She danced gracefully, spoke French like a native, laughed with rare confidence. People noticed. Whispers began. The court stirred with curiosity about the striking Boleyn girl, and then the king noticed. Henry VIII, used to fluttering eyelids and easy affection, was intrigued, but Anne did not swoon. She did not blush, or stumble into his arms like others had before her. She held him at arm's length. She teased, she challenged, she refused. And Henry, a man used to getting what he wanted, fell deeper by the day. He wrote letters, pages filled with longing, flattery, frustration. He offered her the role of royal mistress, the highest unofficial title a woman could hold. And Anne said no. She would not be a footnote, not another fleeting romance. If he wanted her, he would have to marry her. It was a breathtaking gamble, because Henry was already married. Catherine of Aragon was beloved, resilient. The people called her their true queen. She had been Henry's wife for nearly 20 years, and more importantly, she was the aunt of Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The Church would have to be defied, the Pope overruled, the order of Europe shaken. But Anne didn't flinch. She had seen queens wield power behind lace fans and painted lips, and she intended to shape her future, not accept it. What began as flirtation became national crisis. Henry wasn't merely in love, he was obsessed. And in that obsession, He was prepared to tear down the centuries-old pillars of English religion and politics. Catherine refused to go quietly. In the eyes of God and the English court, she was still the rightful queen. Divorce wasn't just controversial, it was unthinkable. But Henry pressed forward. He insisted that his marriage was cursed, a union that should never have been. Catherine, after all, had once been married to his brother. Despite the Pope's prior approval, Henry now saw doom in every sacrament. Anne knew better than to rush. She kept her distance, spoke carefully, moved with precision. Her goal wasn't merely to marry, it was to become Queen of England. Factions formed, noble families whispered, foreign powers stirred. Some courted Anne's favor, others clung fiercely to Queen Catherine. Letters raced across Europe, advisors murmured warnings, but Henry ignored them all. As the years dragged on, his frustration grew. Petitions were sent to Rome, legal arguments twisted like vines. But the Pope, pressured by Emperor Charles, refused to bend. And still, Henry pushed forward. Anne was no longer just a woman he desired. She had become the symbol of a kingdom in transition. It was no longer just a love affair. It was a quiet revolution. And after nearly 7 years of hesitation, scandal, and shifting alliances, Anne's gamble finally paid off. In January of 1533, she secretly married Henry. A bold, dangerous step. Because in the eyes of the Pope and most of Europe, he was still married to Queen Catherine. By June of 1533, Anne Boleyn stood at the very center of England's gaze. She was crowned queen in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It should have been the defining moment of her life. But the mood was far from joyous. London watched with cautious eyes. Some cheered, some prayed for Catherine, and many simply wondered, was this new queen, with her French manners and fierce spirit, a blessing or a curse? Anne didn't rise as a beloved figure. She rose like a storm. Catherine of Aragon had been a quiet symbol of English piety and tradition. Anne was dazzling, provocative, politically shrewd. She wore bold colors, spoke with sharp clarity, and made enemies with breathtaking speed. Her position looked secure, but it was terrifyingly fragile, because everything now rested on one thing: a son. Anne understood that better than anyone. She was no longer just Henry's lover. She was the hope of an entire dynasty. Early in her pregnancy, both she and Henry were elated, certain that the child would be a boy. But in September of 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Anne masked her disappointment with grace. She promised, next time, it would be a son. Henry was less composed. His adoration began to flicker. Doubt crept in. Yet for a time, Anne's star still burned bright. She reshaped the court in her image. Her family rose to new heights, and Anne herself was crowned with sacred oil, once reserved only for kings. Her influence stretched wide. Ambassadors courted her favor. Alliances were reshuffled in the hope of catching her eye. Henry moved England away from Rome. He created the Church of England, placing himself at its head, all to ensure Anne's crown could never be questioned. But even in triumph, dark clouds gathered. Friends whispered, rivals circled, and Henry, restless as ever, began to look beyond her. Anne had reached the summit, but holding that height would take more than wit, or love, or even power. It would take something no woman could fully guarantee: a living son. Almost from the moment she placed the crown on her head, the cracks began to show. Her daughter, Elizabeth, though brilliant and healthy, was not the heir Henry craved. Anne became pregnant again, quickly. but grief followed. Miscarriages took their toll. Each lost child chipped away at the delicate throne beneath her. Henry, once mesmerized, began to drift. Anne, never one to suffer in silence, argued, pleaded, fought to hold her place. But Henry, who prized obedience as much as beauty, grew tired of her fire. The very flame that once drew him close now burned too brightly. Beyond the royal chambers, wolves gathered. Nobles who had tolerated her rise now plotted her fall. Catherine's supporters still saw Anne as an intruder, a thief who had desecrated both marriage and faith. Commoners whispered against her. They blamed her for the break with Rome, and for the new world they did not ask for. And then came Jane Seymour, quiet, demure, everything Anne was not. Where Anne had dazzled with fire, Jane soothed with silence. Henry noticed. Anne, always perceptive, saw it. She tried to reclaim him, flattered, promised more sons, begged for patience. But the king, once so determined, now imagined life without the woman he had once torn a kingdom apart to possess. Her enemies, including Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, sensed the change, and they began to act, quietly, deliberately. They gathered rumors, accusations, and witnesses. The woman who had played ambition like a master's game was losing ground. Anne had won her crown with brilliance and bravery. But in Henry's court, past victories meant very little. And soon, the court that once trembled beneath her feet would close in with cold precision. In the court of Henry VIII, past triumphs meant little. Only fresh success mattered. And Anne's successes were no longer fresh. Her enemies were sharpening their knives. The queen who had once shattered a kingdom was about to learn how quickly a kingdom could shatter her. They didn't come with swords, or with open rebellion. They came with whispers, with silence, secrets, and carefully placed lies. In the back rooms of court, betrayal simmered, quiet, patient, and deadly. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's greatest ally, had turned. Their partnership had always been one of ambition, mutual gain. But now their paths diverged. Anne wanted reform, help for the poor, limits on the greed of England's powerful. Cromwell wanted peace, order, and the king's approval. Anne's boldness had made her inconvenient, and Henry, the man who had once rewritten history for her sake, was growing distant, irritated, cold. She had few allies left. Her charm, once a powerful tool, now grated against a court that longed for gentleness. And waiting in the shadows was Jane Seymour, quiet, composed, the perfect foil to Anne's fading flame. It was Cromwell who made the first move. He saw the king's restlessness, his desire for an exit, but divorce would be messy, embarrassing. So Cromwell offered another way, not divorce, but disgrace. The charges were wild, absurd, and carefully constructed. Adultery, incest, treason, a queen recast as a danger to the very crown she had once redefined. Cromwell twisted courtly glances into guilt. He coaxed confessions through torture. He gathered rumors and shaped them into weapons. Several men were arrested, including Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations made no sense. They contradicted each other. Many were impossible. But in Henry's court, truth was whatever the king needed it to be. Anne felt the noose tightening. She pleaded with Henry, reminded him of their love, of the sacrifices made, of the child they shared. But Henry wouldn't meet her eyes. The man who once destroyed the world for her now looked the other way. In May of 1536, Anne was arrested, taken to the Tower of London. As the great gate slammed shut behind her, she knew it was over. She was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner. a pawn in the very game she had once played so masterfully. Betrayal had sealed her fate. And now, alone in the tower, Anne Boleyn waited for the final move. She stood in the great hall of the tower, facing a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their titles, their fortunes, to her rise. Now, they sat in judgment, cold, watchful, prepared to erase her from the page. The charges were staggering: adultery, high treason, conspiracy against the king himself. Even her own brother was named among her supposed lovers. In another world, such accusations against a crowned queen would have been unthinkable. But here, now, it was theater. A grim, rehearsed performance, meant to give Henry exactly what he needed. Anne defended herself with the same fire that had once won the king's heart. But the room was stone, and her fate already sealed. Anne denied every accusation, calmly, precisely, with the intelligence that had once captivated a king. She reminded the court that she had been anointed with sacred oil, crowned by God's will, chosen to be England's queen. She spoke of loyalty, of sacrifice, of love, but none of it mattered. Not now. The verdict had been written long before she entered the room. The trial was not justice, it was spectacle, a quiet unraveling of a woman who had once shaken the very walls of power. One by one, witnesses stepped forward, many bribed, others coerced. Their words conflicted, dates didn't match, the evidence was thin at best, but the truth was no longer welcome. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George, and the others accused beside her, would die too. Anne's sentence was beheading, a mercy compared to the gruesome ritual reserved for traitors. When the verdict was read, she did not break. She stood tall, her face pale, her spirit unshaken. She declared she was ready, and asked that God have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors closed behind her, the court exhaled. The storm, as they had once called her, was nearly over. But what they did not know was that they weren't erasing Anne Boleyn. They were etching her into legend. Returned to the tower, Anne was no longer a queen. She was a prisoner, awaiting the end. Yet even there, in the cold shadow of death, she did not collapse. She spent her final days in prayer, kneeling on stone floors, whispering forgiveness. She confessed no crime, because in her heart, she believed she had committed none. She said she was not afraid to die, only that her death might buy peace for England and mercy for her small daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting wept, but Anne comforted them. She even joked, bitterly, that she would go down in history as the queen who lost her head. And in that dry humor was the spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry, meanwhile, showed no mercy. He had already turned his gaze to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution was arranged, Henry was planning his next wedding, a final betrayal from the man who had once broken kingdoms just to hold her hand. On May 18th, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She barely slept that night. Instead, she prayed, not only for herself, but for those who had wronged her, for the choices she had made, and for the ambition that had led her here. Henry had arranged for a French swordsman, swifter, cleaner than the English axe. A small mercy, perhaps, but not for Anne's comfort, for the king's conscience. At dawn, Anne dressed with care, a dark gray gown trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle beneath, colors of sacrifice, of grace, of quiet dignity. She pinned her hair beneath a simple cap and stepped forward into the morning mist. The courtyard inside the tower was hushed. A small crowd watched. Courtiers, guards, a few solemn witnesses. Even the walls, it seemed, held their breath. Anne looked thinner, paler, but calm. There were no tears, no pleas, just quiet resolve. She spoke briefly, no accusations, no confessions, only a prayer for the king's health and for England. And then, the sword. Quick, silent, final. Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, history maker, was no more. She was buried swiftly. There was no proper coffin, only an arrow chest, no ceremony, no music, no gold. A queen, once crowned in splendor, now laid to rest without even a name carved in stone. Yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold, unmarked grave. Because her daughter, the small, red-haired child who had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Her reign would mark a golden age of art, of poetry, of exploration, of power. She ruled with fierce spirit, a sharp, calculating mind, and an unyielding resilience that felt, in many ways, like a quiet echo of her mother. Anne Boleyn had changed England. Her ambition helped tear the country from the grip of Rome. Her fall revealed that even queens could be cast aside. Yet through her daughter, her name endured, not in shame, but in legacy. A crown lost in life, but immortalized in history. Anne's true victory wasn't survival. It was the future she made possible. And now, we shift, across time, across ocean, to another story of struggle, defiance, and unexpected revolution. By the early 1770s, across the sea in the American colonies, something simmered. A quiet tension, like a pot left too long over a roaring fire. The colonies, once loyal to Britain, the proud mother country, now bristled with resentment. Trust was fading, and fury was rising. It hadn't started with tea. It began years earlier, with the Stamp Act, a tax on everything from newspapers to playing cards. Then came the Townshend Acts, placing duties on paper, glass, paint, essentials for daily life. Each new law, passed by a distant parliament thousands of miles away, was like a spark landing on dry brush. At first, the response was measured. Petitions, pamphlets, formal protests drafted by colonial assemblies. Merchants began to organize boycotts, and writers, like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson, filled newspapers with passionate defenses of liberty. But over time, frustration deepened. A slow realization crept in. Britain wasn't listening. Worse, it didn't seem to care. Some still hoped that with enough noise, enough protest, the laws would be repealed. And sometimes they were. The Stamp Act was famously revoked. But each small victory was followed by another insult, another law, another tax. It wasn't about money. It never truly was. The taxes were modest, by British standards. But the principle was unbearable. They were being taxed without consent, ruled like distant possessions, not like citizens. Nowhere burned hotter than Boston. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery group, grew louder, bolder. And then, in 1770, violence. British soldiers fired into a crowd of unarmed civilians. The Boston Massacre. Blood had stained the cobblestones. Trust was gone. By 1773, the colonies were teetering, and the final blow came not with an army or a speech, but in the quiet arrival of ships loaded with tea. Crates, stacked and sealed, floated silently in Boston Harbor. The colonists did not yet know it, but that night, as the tea sank into the cold black water, the world would never be the same. In 1773, Parliament made a fatal miscalculation. They believed the colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea. They passed the Tea Act, a law designed to rescue the struggling British East India Company. and to quietly remind the colonies who held the power to tax. On paper, the Tea Act seemed like a generous offer. The East India Company would sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, lowering prices, and offering a luxury good at a bargain. A few pennies cheaper. A gift wrapped in savings. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Because the problem was never the price of tea. It was the principle behind it. The Tea Act kept the tax on tea firmly in place, and accepting it, even at a discount, meant something more. It meant acknowledging that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies without their consent. To many Americans, that was unthinkable. It wasn't about the tea. It was about liberty. Liberty they had been defending for more than a decade. Word of the Tea Act spread swiftly, like sparks leaping from fire to dry brush. Merchants saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly. Patriots saw the truth beneath the bargain. The Crown still believed it could do as it pleased. In Boston, the reaction was sharper, fiercer. This was a city already scarred by massacre, by hardship, by years of tension. And the Tea Act was not a compromise. It was a trap, a test. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a test of loyalty to the cause of liberty. Public meetings swelled. Newspapers burned with fiery rhetoric. The Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized resistance, boycotts, pledges. No East India tea would be unloaded, or sold, or tasted on American soil. Across the colonies, ships carrying tea were turned away. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was clear: we will not be bought. But Boston was different. 3 ships arrived: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. They anchored in the harbor and refused to leave. Royal officials demanded the cargo be unloaded. The colonists refused. A standoff grew, tight as a drawn bowstring. The tension was unbearable. Something had to break. Boston itself began to transform. The harbor was still, but the city was a powder keg. In taverns, churches, and public squares, the colonists debated. The Sons of Liberty moved swiftly. Names like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Paul Revere. They posted notices, held meetings, spoke to packed crowds. Artisans, farmers, merchants, all gathered to listen, to vote, to act. The Old South Meeting House became their heart. Thousands packed the wooden hall, their breath fogging in the air, their voices rising in growing defiance. Every resolution was a hammer blow against British authority. But time was running out. British law demanded that cargo be unloaded within 20 days, or else customs officers would seize it and collect the tax by force. The Sons of Liberty understood the stakes. Once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost. This was no longer about tea. It was about identity, about rights, about the future. Would the colonies submit, or would they stand? Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to yield. He would not allow the tea ships to leave without unloading. He insisted that the law be obeyed. That colonial rage meant nothing. Backing down to him would mean surrendering power to a mob. Boston's standoff became spectacle. Everyone felt it. That cold, sharp stillness before a storm, when even the wind feels like it's holding its breath. All it would take was one spark. And somewhere, in the crowded streets, in the quiet fury of Boston's heart, a decision was quietly forming. A plan that would echo through empires. December 16th, 1773 dawned gray and cold over Boston, a city balanced on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships sat anchored in the harbor, silent, unmoving, like ticking clocks. And now, the final deadline had come. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If not, customs officials could seize the cargo, and British troops could be summoned to enforce the king's law. Everyone knew. Everyone understood what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists allowed it, even once, their cause, their claim to liberty, would begin to unravel. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and colonial farmers crowded into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had walked for miles through icy countryside just to be there. So many arrived that they spilled into the streets, listening from doorways, leaning toward windows, straining to hear the words echoing through the wooden hall. Inside, Samuel Adams presided with quiet strength. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out against tyranny, to plead for action. But even among the fire, there was uncertainty. What could be done without igniting war? How could they stop the tea without losing everything? That afternoon, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Hutchinson refused to yield. The ships would not be allowed to leave. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, the king's law enforced. The room grew tense. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shudder. And then Samuel Adams spoke. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Just one sentence. But it was enough. The debate was over. Outside, a war whoop cut through the winter air. Sharp, high, unmistakable. The signal had been given. Men moved quickly. They smeared soot on their faces, draped themselves in blankets, and tucked feathers into their hair. They weren't pretending to be Mohawks. The disguise was symbolic, a shedding of identity, a transformation into something new, something defiant. As twilight fell, the streets began to stir. Figures moved through the shadows, ordinary men becoming something more. They gathered at Griffin's Wharf, where the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver sat waiting in the harbor. The sea below was dark and cold, biting with winter's edge. There was no shouting, no drunken chaos. This was not a riot. It was a mission, carried out with calm, deliberate precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised men boarded the ships. They overwhelmed the few crewmen on board, but no one was harmed. The sailors stood aside, watching in silence as the work began. Chests were split open with practiced, steady blows. The scent of fresh tea rose into the cold night air. Crate after crate was lifted, heaved, and dropped into the water. Splash, splash, over and over. 342 chests in total. The harbor churned with black tea leaves, soaking and swirling beneath the moonlight. On the docks, spectators stood in stillness, awed by what they saw. British soldiers stationed nearby did nothing. Whether from confusion, sympathy, or quiet fear, no one intervened. The discipline was remarkable. No cargo was stolen, no valuables taken. Only the tea, and only the tea, was destroyed. Even in a city struggling with hunger and hardship, these men resisted the urge to take. They had come to make a statement, not a profit. When it was done, the harbor resembled a swirling black cauldron. Broken crates bobbed in the dark water, torn chests, drifting leaves. The scent of salt and smashed tea filled the air, bittersweet and unforgettable. One by one, the men disappeared into the shadows. They left no names, no declarations, only silence and revolution. The Boston Tea Party was not a riot, not a brawl, not an accident. It was something rarer. A calm, deliberate act of defiance carried out under cover of night. The harbor had become a teapot, 1,000 pounds of protest steeped in darkness. Some curious onlookers scooped leaves from the water, but the Sons of Liberty stopped them. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one would profit from the night's work. This was principle, pure and simple. A statement cast not in violence, but in soaked chests of tea sinking slowly beneath black waters. Boston woke to the sharp scent of salty tea hanging in the winter air, and by midday, everyone knew. Word spread like sparks on dry parchment, whispers in taverns, shouts in marketplaces, columns in hurriedly printed broadsheets. Among the patriots, there was pride, quiet, fierce, swelling. Ordinary men had defied the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was alarm. This was destruction. Property, not just words. Had the colonies crossed a line they could never walk back from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, not just at the loss, but at the message. If the king's authority could be so openly mocked in Boston, where might the next fire ignite? British officials were stunned. They had expected protests, maybe boycotts, maybe even another unruly riot, like those that followed the Stamp Act. They had not expected this, a calm, organized rebellion. Tens of thousands of pounds of royal cargo destroyed without a single pane of glass broken. The captains of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver watched helplessly as their cargo disappeared. Into the sea, into history. The loss was recorded as over 10,000 pounds, a fortune. But the real loss was something far less visible and far more permanent: trust, loyalty, and the fading illusion that Britain still ruled with consent. The night the tea sank, something else rose. A quiet, undeniable truth. The age of peaceful protest was ending, and Boston was ready. When word reached London, the reaction was swift and furious. To British leaders, this wasn't protest. It was rebellion, open, mocking, unforgivable. King George III was said to grow cold upon hearing the news. Parliament, already weary of colonial defiance, erupted in outrage. They demanded punishment, not just for Boston, but as a warning to every colony that dared follow. Their answer was brutal. A series of laws so harsh they became known across America as the Intolerable Acts. The first blow came fast: the Boston Port Act. In a single order, Parliament closed the harbor, Boston's economic heart. No ships in, no ships out. Trade stopped, supplies dwindled. The once busy docks fell silent, but it didn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped the colony of its self-rule. Royal officials now held power. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British authorities to escape trial by returning to England. A clear message: the king's agents were untouchable. To drive the point home, British troops were quartered in Boston, living among the very people they were meant to control. The message was clear: rebellion would be crushed. Liberty was a luxury the crown would no longer tolerate. But Parliament's heavy hand had an unexpected effect. Rather than frighten the other colonies, it united them. As Boston suffered, its harbor closed, its streets patrolled, its people starving under martial law, something stirred across America, a wave of sympathy, of anger, and of unity. Wagons loaded with food and supplies rolled into the city from neighboring colonies. Letters poured in, pledges of support, secret meetings. What had once been a Massachusetts problem was quickly becoming an American one. In punishing Boston, Britain had hoped to make an example. Instead, they made a symbol, a city under siege, transformed into a rallying cry. The flames of revolution, once flickering in scattered corners, now began to blaze. From colony to colony, the fire spread, and there would be no easy way to extinguish it. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond Massachusetts' rocky shores. Outrage became something else. Unity. For years, the colonies had felt like distant cousins, divided by geography, by trade, by faith. They argued, they competed, they lived apart. But when Parliament closed Boston's harbor and stripped away Massachusetts' right to govern itself, the message was clear. If it could happen to Boston, it could happen to any of them. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, South Carolina to New Hampshire, the response came swiftly. Wagons rolled north loaded with food, supplies, and words of support. Town meetings buzzed with anger. Printers worked by candlelight, pressing news into the hands of a restless people. This was no longer Boston's fight. It was everyone's. And so, in September of 1774, something extraordinary happened. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. The First Continental Congress. Men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, John Adams. Once regional voices, now architects of something greater. Their goal, at least publicly, was not independence. Most still hoped for reconciliation, for respect under the British Crown. But beneath the formal petitions, a deeper understanding took root. The colonies could no longer afford to stand apart. At the Congress, they pledged a unified boycott of British goods. They vowed support, that an attack on one colony would be considered an attack on all. In taverns and meeting houses, ordinary men and women began using words that had once been whispered: unity, resistance, liberty. In trying to silence Boston, Britain had done something else. It had welded the colonies into a single and dangerous idea. Not just New Yorkers, not just Virginians, not just Bostonians, Americans. The winds of revolution were no longer gentle. They were gathering strength, and the moment to stop them had passed. The night the tea sank into Boston Harbor, it wasn't just crates that were destroyed. It was the illusion that these colonies would remain loyal forever. In the months that followed, that spark caught fire. Polite petitions became open resistance. Storehouses filled with gunpowder. Militias began to drill in plain sight. And in quiet corners of taverns, men who once toasted the king now whispered about revolution. Boston, battered but unbowed, became a symbol. The more Parliament tightened its grip, the more the colonies slipped through its fingers. Every ship that passed Boston's silent harbor carried a message. This is what tyranny looks like, and this is what defiance feels like. Parliament had hoped to make an example of Boston. Instead, they made it a martyr. From Georgia to New Hampshire, the colonies saw it clearly. Their fates were no longer separate. Resistance was no longer about tea. It was about survival, identity, freedom. By the spring of 1775, tension boiled just outside Boston. In quiet villages like Lexington and Concord, British troops marched to seize weapons. But what they found waiting for them were armed farmers, ordinary men, ready to defend their rights with musket fire. The first shots of the American Revolution would soon ring out, and if you traced the echoes back, they would lead not to muskets or marching soldiers, but to crates of tea tumbling into cold Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party taught the world something important. Revolutions don't always begin with fanfare. Sometimes they begin quietly, with a small group of ordinary people standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear. In dumping the tea, the colonists weren't just rejecting a tax. They were rejecting an empire. And though the road ahead would be bloody, bitter, and uncertain, one truth had become undeniable. The American colonies were no longer loyal subjects. They were something else now, something new, something dangerous. They were revolutionaries, and they were just getting started. But let's step even further back now, long before the cries for liberty in Boston, long before redcoats and resolutions, before the pyramids of Giza, before Babylon, before even Stonehenge. There was Corral. Hidden in the dry valleys of coastal Peru, Corral rose nearly 5,000 years ago, and then faded quietly into the sands of time. For centuries, the world forgot it had ever existed. The Supa Valley, where Corral once thrived, seems at first glance a place abandoned by life. Parched, barren, windswept and sunbaked. A thin silver river snakes through dust and stone, barely a thread in a vast cracked canvas. It looks inhospitable, unwelcoming, empty. But the people of Corral saw something different. They did not fear the desert. They shaped it. Corral wasn't just a scattering of huts. It was a city, planned, expansive, alive. Spanning over 150 acres, it was filled with pyramids, plazas, residences, and ceremonial spaces. A complex society, blossoming long before the Egyptians began stacking stones skyward. And they did it without the wheel, without metal, without writing. They built with stone, with earth, and with will. Structures rose through collective effort, through memory, through shared vision. For thousands of years, Corral remained hidden. Its mounds were mistaken for hills, its pyramids buried under sand and misidentified as mere natural formations. It wasn't until the late 20th century that archaeologist Ruth Shady uncovered the truth. And with her discovery, the story of civilization was rewritten. The Americas, long believed to have joined history late, were now revealed to have been present at its dawn. Corral had risen, flourished, and vanished in total anonymity. And now, after millennia of silence, its stones were beginning to speak. They whispered of a people who built without conquest, who lived without war, a society based on knowledge, balance, and collective harmony. To most eyes, the Supa Valley looks lifeless. The wind howls, the earth cracks, the river barely flows. But the people of Corral saw potential. They saw a canvas. Their first triumph was agriculture. They learned to tame the seasonal floods, guiding the river with simple but brilliant irrigation systems. From barren soil, they coaxed life, cotton, beans, guava, squash, sweet potatoes, and above all, cotton, their treasure. Spun into nets and textiles, cotton became currency. It became trade. It became connection. Corral's people built bonds with coastal communities, trading dried fish and handmade goods for shells, stones, and stories from faraway lands. They worked with nature, not against it. Their buildings were designed to endure heat and rare, punishing rains. They read the stars, watched the skies, planned their lives with astronomical precision. They were not isolated. They were not primitive. They were connected. In a land where life should not have been possible, Corral thrived. Through wisdom, through innovation, through community. They didn't conquer the desert with brute force. They partnered with it, listened to its rhythms, respected its power. And from that partnership, they built something not just functional, but extraordinary. Against all odds, Corral blossomed into a beacon of civilization, and it was only beginning to rise. Rising from the desert like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Corral challenge everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. These weren't small, crude mounds built by primitive hands. They were deliberate, massive. Architectural works full of vision, organization, and ambition. At the heart of the city stood the Pyramid Mayor, the largest of Corral's structures. It stretched more than 450 feet in length and towered nearly 60 feet above the desert floor. A feat of engineering on par with the great wonders of the ancient world. Built with stone, with mud, with reed-woven bags filled with rocks. It was designed not just to withstand the harsh desert, but to survive earthquakes. And it did. For nearly 5 millennia, it has stood, silent, resilient, eternal. But unlike the pyramids of Egypt, Corral's pyramids were not tombs. They were not built to hold the dead. They were built for the living. Temples and public spaces crowned their summits, accessible by broad staircases. Fires once burned at their heights. Rituals unfolded beneath the endless sky. At the base, plazas opened wide, some sunken, circular, meant for gathering. Here, thousands could assemble, to celebrate, to worship, to govern. The design of Corral suggests a society deeply connected to one another and to the cosmos. Around the pyramids spread homes and workshops, likely for priests, artisans, administrators, farmers. The city was planned, balanced, alive with purpose. The pyramids were not just aligned with the land, but with the sky. Sunrises, solstices, the movement of stars. Architecture for Corral wasn't just practical. It was spiritual, mathematical, cosmic. And when you walk among the worn stones today, it's hard not to feel something stir. These great structures were built without metal tools, without wheels, without animals to carry the weight. And yet, they rise with symmetry, with precision, with breathtaking scale. The pyramids of Corral were not monuments to war. They were bridges, linking earth and sky, community and cosmos, humanity and eternity. And still today, they whisper across the sands, a story that refuses to be forgotten. And within that story is something rare, something different. Because here, among the ruins of Corral, there are no weapons, no battle-scarred walls, no mass graves, no signs of conquest or collapse. Unlike so many other civilizations that rose through violence, Corral rose through peace. It's a revelation that humbles the imagination, a society that did not conquer but cooperated, that invested in science, music, ritual, and shared belief. Their plazas and pyramids were not shrines to victory. They were centers of community, of celebration, of purpose, of gathering. They chose to build together rather than destroy apart. Trade was their lifeblood. Cotton grown along the riverbanks was spun into fishing nets. Those nets were traded with coastal villages, exchanged for dried fish, a vital source of protein. But trade brought more than food. Colorful shells from the Pacific, precious stones from the highlands, tropical fruits from faraway valleys. This network, woven through exchange, stitched the region together, not through domination, but through mutual benefit. At the center of it all, Corral, a city that thrived not by crushing others, but by connecting them. Religious and ceremonial life played a vital role in holding the city of Corral together. Its sunken plazas, wide and open beneath the sky, were more than architecture. They were stages, designed for ritual, for rhythm, for unity. Music filled those gatherings, flutes carved from condor bones, drums stretched with deer hide. Soundscapes rose and echoed across the stone courtyards, tying individual lives to something larger. Leadership in Corral didn't come from conquest. It wasn't enforced by soldiers and steel. It flowed from spiritual authority and careful civic planning. Imagine the work: massive construction projects, seasonal agriculture, long-distance trade routes, all managed without kings or armies, all without leaving behind the brutal scars of war. In an ancient world so often shaped by conflict, Corral stands apart, a quiet, radiant exception, a reminder that civilization does not need to rise on the broken backs of the conquered. It can be built instead on the steady, patient power of trust, collaboration, and shared belief. Corral wasn't just a city of stone and commerce. It was a living song, alive with sound, ceremony, and spiritual rhythm. Archaeologists, digging carefully through dry sand, have uncovered a treasure trove of instruments. Flutes carved from the bones of condors and pelicans, whistles shaped from deer antlers, small drums fashioned from hides and tuned with care. These weren't toys. They were crafted to specific pitches, designed to carry sound across vast open spaces. In a world without writing, music was the language of the soul. Close your eyes and imagine it. The slow beat of drums rising at dusk, flutes keening like wind across the dunes, feet pounding rhythm into the sunken plazas, fires crackling atop the pyramids, and priests, cloaked in woven robes, chanting beneath the stars to the gods of river, sky, and time. In those moments, Corral wasn't just a city, it was a symphony. Even its layout tells a story of ritual. The plazas weren't empty space. They were gathering grounds, carefully placed, strategically shaped. Sunken circular courts acted like ancient amphitheaters. They focused attention, amplified sound. Above them, the pyramids rose, not as tombs, but as sacred mountains, linking earth to the heavens. Rituals likely marked the passing of seasons, planting and harvest, the turning of stars. Music wasn't entertainment, it was connection. Between people, between nature and the divine, between the seen and the unseen. There were no murals of war, no altars to bloodthirsty gods, no signs of sacrifice. Corral's spirituality seemed rooted in harmony, in gratitude, in reverence. Even today, when the wind whistles through the broken walls, you can almost hear it. The echoes of flutes, the hush of drums, the long-forgotten music of a people who found meaning in the silence of the desert. But Corral wasn't just ritual and art. It was an engineering marvel, a testament to human ingenuity in one of Earth's harshest places. No metal tools, no wheels, no beasts of burden. And yet, they built a city from stone and earth that has stood for nearly 5,000 years. Their pyramids weren't made from delicate bricks. They were forged from enormous stones carried across dry, brittle valleys. The people of Corral used reed bags woven from river plants to haul heavy rocks, a clever, flexible solution born from the land itself. Layer upon layer, stone and rubble, fitted together with patience and care, not just to rise, but to last. And rise it did. Corral sits in a region known for earthquakes, but its pyramids are still standing. Why? Because their builders understood the earth. They designed for movement, wide foundations, rounded corners, layered fills that absorbed shock, structures that could sway with the trembling ground and not break. It was architecture not just for beauty, but for survival. It was engineering not born from textbooks, but from an intimate knowledge of the earth itself. The people of Corral didn't fight their environment. They listened to it, studied it, moved with it. And in doing so, they built something timeless. Water management was one of their quiet triumphs. Even in a desert, they made things grow. They built channels and narrow canals, guiding the river's waters to where they were needed most. Not a drop was wasted. Every stream was sacred. The layout of Corral was more than aesthetic. major structures aligned with the heavens. Sunken plazas, designed with geometric precision, acted as instruments, tracking the sun, marking solstices, predicting seasons. Even the city's organization spoke volumes. Residential areas, administrative zones, ceremonial centers, all arranged in harmony, balancing daily life with sacred space. They built not just for the moment, but for generations. Modern engineers still marvel at Corral's resilience. They are reminded that greatness is not measured by tools, but by wisdom. Sometimes, the deepest knowledge comes from watching the land and working with it, not against it. Corral's stones have endured storms, earthquakes, and time itself. They stand as quiet witnesses, a city that dreamed and made those dreams real in the desert sands. For centuries, Corral thrived, a city of peace, of music, of architecture, and trade. And then, without warning and without destruction, it was gone. No fires marked its fall. No armies marched through its gates. No blood stained its plazas. It simply faded. Its pyramids fell silent. Its flutes were buried. Its plazas emptied. Why did they leave? That question lingers still, like a ghost moving through the wind. Some scholars believe environmental change was the final blow. A long drought, a faltering river, agriculture slowly withered, and with it, trade. The careful balance Corral had kept with the desert may have finally tipped. Others suggest trade routes changed. New cities rose. Corral's goods, cotton, dried fish, fruit, may have lost their value. Commerce faded, influence waned, and people moved on. Still others whisper of inner decline. No writings remain, so we can only imagine political strife, religious shifts, exhaustion after centuries of glory. Even peaceful societies can fracture under pressure. But it wasn't sudden. Corral did not fall. It faded. Families likely left one by one, in search of new valleys, new rivers, new beginnings. Children who once ran across sunlit plazas grew up telling stories of a city behind them, stories that drifted into myth. The desert reclaimed what humans had made. Sand swept over the stones. Flutes were buried beneath shifting dunes. The hum of ritual and music fell silent. What remained was stillness, a landscape of sleeping mounds, a whisper beneath the sand. For nearly 4,000 years, Corral waited, hidden beneath the dust, forgotten by history. Travelers passed the rounded hills, never knowing that beneath their feet lay the ruins of one of humanity's oldest cities. Older than the pyramids, older than most had ever imagined. To the outside world, those hills had seemed like nothing more than natural mounds, shaped by the wind, shaped by time. No one imagined they were passing over the remains of one of the world's oldest cities. But in the late 20th century, Corral would finally speak again. In the 1990s, Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady led a team into the Supi Valley, drawn by quiet questions, by the feeling that these hills might hold something long forgotten, and what they uncovered would rewrite the story of human civilization in the Americas. Layer by patient layer, the sand was brushed away. Walls emerged, stone steps, grand plazas, pyramids, a city older than anyone had dared to dream. Radiocarbon dating confirmed the impossible. Corral was over 4,600 years old, a sister to the earliest cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt. The discovery shook the foundations of archaeology. Before Corral, many believed that complex civilization had come late to the Americas, a shadow cast by the Old World. Corral proved otherwise. It proved that monumental architecture, urban planning, and social complexity arose here too, independently, long before the Incas, long before the Maya, Ruth Shady's team found more than buildings. They found life, flutes and drums, fishing nets, textiles, knotted records, quipu, offerings to gods now long unnamed. Each artifact a fragment of a song composed thousands of years ago. Corral's rediscovery was more than an academic milestone. It was a resurrection. A civilization that had slept beneath the sands of the Supi Valley for thousands of years now stood beneath the open sky once more. Its plazas, once quiet, now kissed again by the same winds that had carried the sounds of flutes, of footsteps, of laughter. Today, Corral is honored as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, priceless link to humanity's first dreams, of building, of belonging, of believing. The sands had hidden Corral well, but in the end, the stones endured, waiting for someone to listen, to remember. Corral stands today as a silent giant, a reminder that the roots of civilization run far deeper than we once believed. Among its plazas and pyramids, the ancient stones still whisper, a story not of conquest, but of connection, not of blood, but of beauty. Before Greece, before Rome, before even the pyramids of Egypt, there was Corral. They built without wheels, mapped the stars without writing, created a world of trade, ritual, and resilience, all without leaving scars of war on their land. In an era so often defined by empires and conflict, Corral offers a different vision, a society that chose knowledge over domination, that believed greatness came from harmony. Corral's legacy reaches far beyond the dry riverbeds of the Supi Valley. It challenges the idea that civilization began in only one place. It reminds us that humans everywhere have dreamed of building, of connecting, of enduring. Walk through Corral's ruins today, and you might hear it. The faint echo of ancient drums, the hush of voices bartering in the plaza, the laughter of children racing through stone alleys under a sky wide with stars. Their lives, their dreams, their music are still here, etched into the bones of the earth. Corral teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, waiting beneath the sand, waiting to be remembered, to inspire again. In the vast timeline of human history, Corral is not just a relic. It is a beacon, a reminder that even in the harshest deserts, even under the heaviest sands, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can still take root and build a world that reaches for the stars.